The rain over Tokyo fell in thin silver threads against the windows of the Yamashiro estate, and Imani Carter stood pressed against the wall outside the study, one hand flat against the cool wood paneling, listening to her husband laugh. She had not meant to stop there. She had been carrying a tray of tea back to the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the polished floors, when she heard his voice rise above the others, warm and easy in a way he never was with her. Kaito Yamashiro did not laugh often. In 2 years of marriage, she had counted the times on one hand. But tonight, behind the heavy door of his study, surrounded by the men who ran the other territories of the city, he was laughing freely, and the sound of it stopped her cold. "She still tries," Kaito was saying, and she could hear the smile curling through his words. "Every night. Cooks. Waits up. Asks how my day was, as if I have days to speak of. As if this life has days that can be spoken of at a dinner table." Laughter rippled through the room, low and amused. She recognized the voice of Hiroshi Sano, the head of the Eastern Docks, and beside him the clipped tone of a man she only knew as Fujimoto, who ran the import routes through Osaka. "She's the only one still trying," Kaito said, and there was something almost fond buried under the mockery, something that made it worse instead of better. "Everyone else in this house learned the rules within a month. She has been here 2 years, and she still thinks this is a marriage." Imani's fingers tightened around the edge of the tray until the porcelain rattled softly against the metal. She set it down on the narrow table beside the door because her hands had begun to shake, and she did not trust herself to carry it any farther. "She's a beautiful woman," Sano said. "American. Georgia," Kaito answered, and she heard him take a slow drink of something, the particular scrape of a glass returning to a wooden table. Her father worked construction. Her mother taught grade school. A very ordinary life, until she met me at a hotel bar in Atlanta and thought she had found something exciting. And now she cooks your dinner and waits for you to come home," Fujimoto said, and there was no unkindness in his voice, only the detached observation of a man discussing a piece of furniture. "That is either love or foolishness." "It is foolishness," Kaito said. "I have told her nothing of what I do. I have given her nothing to hold on to except a house and a name. And still she tries." Imani stood very still in the hallway, and for the first time in 2 years of marriage, she let herself hear what she had always suspected but never allowed herself to fully believe. She had built a version of him in her mind, a version that was cold because the world had made him cold, distant because his work demanded distance, closed because opening himself to her would put her in danger. She had told herself that his silence at dinner was protection, that his late nights were burdens he carried alone, so she would not have to carry them too. She had built a cathedral out of his silence and called it love, and now she was standing outside a door listening to him call her foolish for it. "Perhaps you should tell her something," Sano said, and his tone had shifted, become more serious. "A wife who knows nothing is a wife who cannot be trusted with anything, but a wife who is kept in the dark forever eventually stops trying at all. Yours has not stopped. That means somewhere she still believes there is something worth trying for." There was a pause. Imani held her breath. "She believes what I allow her to believe," Kaito said finally, and his voice had cooled, the warmth of a moment ago folding back into something flatter, more controlled. "That is enough." Something inside her chest went very quiet and very still, the way a room goes still right before a window shatters. She picked the tray back up with hands that had stopped shaking because she had made a decision without consciously deciding to make it, and walked back toward the kitchen with her spine straight and her face unreadable. She did not sleep that night, though she lay beside him in the wide bed with the silk sheets he had bought without asking her preference, listening to his breathing slow into the even rhythm of real sleep. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Atlanta, about the woman she had been before she met him, a hospital administrator who managed a floor of 40 nurses and never once needed anyone's permission to have an opinion. She thought about how carefully, how completely, she had folded that woman away in the 2 years since, replacing her with someone who waited. By morning she had decided that the waiting was over, though she gave no outward sign of it. She rose before him, as she always did, and made coffee, and set his cup at his place at the table, And when he came down in his charcoal suit with his hair still damp from the shower, she smiled at him the way she always smiled at him, and he did not notice a single thing had changed. "You're quiet," he said, glancing at her over the rim of his cup. "I'm always quiet in the morning," she said, and that, at least, was true. He left for the office at 7, as he always did, and the black car pulled out of the gate with its tinted windows, and Imani stood at the window watching it go and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water down her spine, that she knew almost nothing about the man she had married. She knew the shape of his shoulders and the sound of his key in the lock. She did not know what he actually did all day, who actually answered to him, what actually happened behind the door of that study when men like Sano and Fujimoto came to drink his whiskey and speak in half-sentences that meant something entirely different than what they said. She decided, standing there, that she would find out. It began small. She started paying attention to things she had trained herself not to notice. The men who stood outside the gate at all hours, dressed like gardeners, but never touching a single plant. The way certain visitors were shown in through the side entrance instead of the front. The locked door on the second floor that she had always assumed was a storage room and had never once tried to open. She began writing things down in a small notebook she kept hidden inside a hollowed-out paperback on her nightstand. Dates and names and fragments of conversation she overheard through walls that were, she was starting to realize, not nearly as thick as Kaido believed them to be. 2 weeks after the night in the hallway, a woman came to the house whom Imani had never met before. She was perhaps 50, dressed in a gray suit with her hair pulled back severely, and she was shown into the study without ceremony, without introduction, the way a person is treated when everyone already knows exactly who they are and why they've come. Imani, arranging flowers in the hall, a task Kaido had assigned her early in the marriage and she had never questioned until now, watched the woman pass and felt something sharpen in her chest. She waited until the housekeeper, an older woman named Reiko who had worked for the Yamashiro family for over 20 years and treated Imani with a careful, distant courtesy that had never once tipped into warmth, was occupied elsewhere. Then Imani walked, unhurried, past the study door and stopped just beyond it, exactly where she had stood the night everything changed. "The northern route is compromised," the woman was saying, her voice clipped and businesslike. 3 shipments in the last month. "Someone is talking." "Or someone is skimming," Kaido said. "Find out which. If it's Nakashima's people, then Nakashima answers for it personally," Kaido said, and his voice had that flatness in it again, the one Imani now recognized as the sound of him deciding something was already finished, already dead, whether the world knew it yet or not. Imani moved away from the door before she could hear more, her pulse loud in her ears, and went back to her flowers with hands that trembled just slightly, arranging stems she could no longer really see. That night at dinner, she watched him more closely than she had allowed herself to in a long time. She watched the way his eyes moved to the windows every few minutes, cataloging something, some habit of vigilance, so deeply worn into him that he probably didn't know he was doing it. She watched the way he held his chopsticks with a precision that suggested every motion in his life was deliberate, considered, controlled. She thought about what Sano had said, that a wife who knows nothing eventually stops trying, and wondered, with a bitterness that surprised her in its sharpness, whether Kaido had wanted her to stop trying all along. Whether the silence had never been protection at all, but simply the shape of a man who did not believe she was owed anything more. "You've been quiet all week," he said, setting down his glass. It was the first time in days he had commented on anything about her at all. "Have I?" she said. "You usually ask about my day. Would you tell me the truth if I did?" The question landed in the room, like something dropped from a height. Kaido's chopstick stilled over his plate, and for a moment the only sound was the rain against the windows, the same rain that had been falling the night she stood outside his study door. "What kind of question is that?" he said finally, and his voice was careful now, testing. "An honest one," Imani said, holding his gaze. "You could just answer it." He studied her for a long moment, something moving behind his dark eyes that she couldn't fully read. Not anger, not yet, but something adjacent to it, something wary. "No," he said finally. "Probably not." It was the most honest thing he had said to her in 2 years, and it hurt worse than a lie would have. "Thank you," she said quietly, and went back to her food, and did not ask him anything else for the rest of the meal, and he watched her the whole time with an expression she had never seen on him before, something that looked almost like unease. The days that followed took on a strange double rhythm. On the surface, nothing had changed. She still made his coffee, still arranged her flowers, still moved through the house with the same practiced grace she had cultivated for 2 years. But underneath it, she was cataloging everything. She learned the names of the men who came and went: Sano, Fujimoto, a sharp-eyed younger man named Ren who seemed to run something like security, an older enforcer everyone called simply Tetsu who never spoke at all but whose presence made the air in a room feel thinner. She learned that Tuesdays and Thursdays brought different visitors than the rest of the week, and that the locked door on the second floor was opened only by Kaido himself, using a key he wore against his chest on a chain she had noticed years ago and never once asked about. She was in the garden on a gray Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the conversation in the hallway, when the first real danger arrived, though she did not recognize it as danger at first. A car she did not know pulled through the gates, not one of the sleek black sedans that usually came and went, but an older, nondescript sedan, gray and unremarkable, the kind of car built specifically to be forgotten. 2 men got out. Imani, kneeling by the flower beds with dirt on her hands, watched them approach the front door with a wrongness she felt before she could name it. The way they moved, too aware of the cameras mounted along the eaves, too careful about where they placed their feet on the gravel path. She rose slowly and moved toward the side entrance instead of the front, some instinct from a life she thought she'd left behind in Atlanta kicking in, the instinct of a woman who had once managed a hospital floor during a mass casualty event and learned, in the worst hour of her professional life, that the body knows danger before the mind finishes naming it. Inside, she found Reiko in the kitchen, and something in Imani's face must have communicated urgency, because the older woman's expression sharpened immediately. 2 men at the front, Imani said quietly. "I don't know them." Reiko did not hesitate. She moved to a panel near the pantry that Imani had always assumed was a fuse box and pressed a sequence of buttons Imani had never seen before, and somewhere in the house, an alarm that made no sound Imani could hear began to do its work. Within 90 seconds, Ren appeared in the kitchen doorway, a gun already in his hand, his young face utterly calm. "Upstairs," he said to Imani.
"Now."
"What's happening?" "Now," he repeated, and something in his tone left no room for negotiation, and Imani found herself moving, her heart hammering, up the back stairs toward the bedroom she shared with a husband who had told her almost nothing true in 2 years, and yet, in this moment, some part of her understood with total clarity that his silence had not been about protecting himself.
It had been about this.
About men who arrived in forgettable cars for reasons that ended in violence. From the bedroom window, half hidden behind the curtain, she watched the confrontation unfold in the courtyard below, and it happened so fast that later, trying to reconstruct it, she would only be able to remember pieces. The flash of movement as Tetsu appeared from the side of the house, the sound, sharp and short, that she would later understand had been a single gunshot, one of the strangers falling and not rising again, the other raising his hands too late to matter, as Ren closed the distance and put him on the ground with a brutal, economical motion that looked less like a fight and more like a piece of machinery completing its function. It was over in less than a minute. Imani stood at the window with her hand pressed over her mouth, and it was only then, watching the aftermath, the quiet, efficient movement of men dragging bodies and cleaning gravel, that she saw Kaido's car come tearing through the gates, far faster than she had ever seen him drive, and watched him get out before the car had fully stopped and crossed the courtyard in long strides, his eyes moving across the scene with a terrible, focused speed until they found the house, found the window, found her. He was inside and up the stairs faster than she had ever seen him move, and when he came through the bedroom door his composure had cracked in a way she had never witnessed, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild in a way that did not match the controlled man she had married. "Are you hurt?" he said, and it was not a question, it was closer to a demand, his hands coming up to her face, her shoulders, Checking her the way she imagined, he checked a room for exits. "I'm fine," she said. "Ai fine, Kaito." "Did they get inside? Did they touch you?" "I'm fine," she said again more firmly, catching his wrists in her hands to still them. "Reiko got me upstairs. Ren and Tetsu handled it." He exhaled something that was almost a sound of pain, and for one unguarded moment he pulled her against his chest so hard it nearly knocked the breath from her, his hand cradling the back of her head, and she felt something in him that she had never felt before in 2 years of marriage. Not the careful, contained affection he sometimes offered her, but something closer to terror, closer to a man who had, for one full minute in the car racing home, believed he might lose something he could not survive losing. "I should have told you," he said into her hair, so quietly she almost didn't catch it. "I should have told you what this house was." She pulled back enough to look at him, her hands still holding his wrists, and something in her that had been curling tight for 3 weeks finally uncoiled enough to speak. "I heard you," she said, 3 weeks ago. In the study. I heard what you said about me." His face went very still. "You called me foolish," she said, and her voice did not shake, though everything in her chest was shaking. "You said I still tried because I didn't know any better. You said I believe what you allow me to believe." "Imani." "Was it true?" she said. "Any of it?" He was quiet for a long moment, and outside, she could hear the low murmur of men still working in the courtyard, the sound of a car engine, the ordinary machinery of a violence that had apparently always been happening just beneath the surface of her life. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, stripped of the polish he usually kept around every word. "I called you foolish because I was afraid of what it meant that you still tried," he said. "Because everyone else who has ever been close to me learned, eventually, that closeness to me is a wound waiting to happen. My father learned it. My brother learned it before he died learning it. I have watched every person who ever loved me pay for it in ways I could not stop. And you kept trying anyway, every night without knowing any of that, and I told myself it was because you were naive. It was easier to believe you were naive than to believe you were simply braver than anyone I have ever known." Imani felt something crack open in her chest, something she had been holding rigid for 3 weeks. "You don't get to decide what I can carry," she said. "You don't get to keep me in the dark and then call me foolish for staying in a room you locked me into." "I know," he said. "I'm not leaving," she said, and it surprised her how true it was, even now, even after everything. "But I am done being someone you laugh about with your friends because I dared to care whether you came home." "I will never do that again," he said, and his hand came up to cup her jaw, his thumb tracing along her cheekbone with a gentleness that felt entirely unlike the man who had, 20 minutes ago, ordered a body dragged off his property. "You are not foolish, Imani. You never were. I was the fool for 2 years, mistaking your strength for something smaller than it is." She wanted, badly, to simply let that be the end of it, to fold into him and let the fear and adrenaline of the last hour dissolve into whatever this new honesty between them might become. But the woman who had once run a hospital floor through a crisis was still awake somewhere inside her, and that woman wanted answers, not just apology. "Tell me what's happening," she said. "All of it."
Who were those men?
"Why did they come here?" Kaito studied her for a long moment, and she watched him make a decision behind his eyes, watched 2 years of careful compartmentalization begin, finally, to give way. "Sit down," he said. "I'll tell you everything." He told her about Nakashima, a rival who had been probing the edges of Yamashiro territory for months, testing responses, looking for weakness. He told her about the northern shipping routes and the money that moved through them, and the men who had grown greedy skimming from those routes, and the suspicion that Nakashima's people had turned one of his own lieutenants. He told her, haltingly, about his brother, who had died 8 years ago trying to broker peace with a rival family and had been killed for his trouble, a death that had put Kaito in control of the organization at 26 years old, unprepared and furious and determined never again to let anyone close enough to be used against him. "That's why the silence," Imani said quietly, when he had finished. "Not because you didn't trust me. Because you were terrified of what it would cost me to know you." "Yes," he said. That's not protection, Kaido, she said. That's just fear wearing protection's clothes. He almost smiled at that, a small, tired thing. You sound like my brother. Good, she said. Someone should have been telling you that for 8 years. Over the following days, the house existed in a state of quiet, coiled tension. Run doubled the men at the gate. Tetsu was a near-constant presence in the courtyard, moving with the patient watchfulness of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. Kaido came home earlier than he had in months, and though the danger had not passed, something between them had shifted permanently. He told her things now, not everything, but enough that she stopped feeling like a guest in her own marriage. She learned that the man behind the sedan had been identified as one of Nakashima's soldiers, sent not to kill Kaido but to send a message, to test how the Yamashiro family would respond to violation of the estate itself. He's escalating, Kaido told her one night, standing at the window of his study with a glass of whiskey he had not touched, watching the dark garden below. He wants a war. He believes I am weak because I have not answered violence with violence in over a year. Are you going to give him one? Imani asked, standing in the doorway. I don't have a choice anymore, Kaido said. Not after today. Not after he came onto this property, near you. Then let me help, Imani said. He turned, something sharp and immediate in his expression.
No.
I didn't ask permission, Imani said, crossing the room to stand in front of him. I have spent 3 weeks learning this house, learning your world, whether you wanted me to or not. I know who comes and goes. I know which of your men look nervous when Sano's name comes up. I noticed something yesterday I haven't told you yet. That stopped him. What? Reiko, Imani said. When the men came through the gate, she knew exactly what to do, down to the button sequence. That's not the reaction of a housekeeper. That's the reaction of someone who has done this before, recently, and practiced it. But when I mentioned to her yesterday that I thought the security response was impressive, she said something strange. She said, "We've had drills since the shipment problem started." Kaido, she knew about the shipment problems before you told me. Before, I assume, most people knew. Kaido's face had gone very still, the particular stillness she now recognized as the calculation of a dangerous man rearranging a picture in his mind. Reiko has been with his family for 23 years, he said slowly. I'm not saying she's dangerous, Imani said. I'm saying she knows things. And people who know things get talked to by people who want information. I think someone got to her, or is trying to. I think you should watch her, quietly, before you decide what it means. He was silent for a long moment, and then he crossed the room and kissed her, hard and sudden, his hand cradling the back of her head, and when he pulled back his eyes were bright with something that was not quite relief, and not quite pride but close to both. I married a woman who could have run this organization better than I have, he said. I married a man who almost let his fear talk him out of ever finding that out, she said. The investigation into Reiko took 4 careful days, conducted so quietly that even Imani was not told the details, only that Ren was watching the older woman's movements, her calls, the small deviations in her routine. On the 4th day, Ren came to Kaido's study with a face carved from stone and confirmed what Imani had suspected. Reiko had been approached 3 weeks earlier by a man claiming to represent a real estate developer, offering an absurd sum for information about the household's routines, security patterns, the comings and goings of the family. She had not told anyone, had not reported it, had simply begun, quietly, feeding small pieces of information in exchange for money that would let her finally retire to be near her ailing sister in Nagoya. Kaido's reaction, when Imani found him afterward, was colder than anything she had seen from him before, a fury banked so deep it barely showed on the surface, which somehow made it more frightening than if he had shouted. She's been with this family since before I could walk, he said, staring at nothing. And she sold us for a nurse's salary and a plane ticket. What will you do? Imani asked carefully. That's not something you need to carry, he said, which was the old Kaido speaking, the one who protected by withholding, and Imani reached out and put her hand over his. I'm not asking you to protect me from it, she said. I'm asking because I want to understand the world I chose to stay in. All of it, even the parts that aren't gentle. He looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes, and then he said quietly, "She'll be questioned. If she gives us Nakashima's contact, if she helps us end this before more people die, her life will be spared, and she'll be sent somewhere far from here, somewhere she can't do more damage. If she refuses to cooperate," he stopped. "I understand," Imani said, and she did, in the way that a person understands the weather even when they don't like the forecast, the way she had once understood, standing over a dying patient in a hospital hallway, that some outcomes could not be softened no matter how much a person wished otherwise. Reiko cooperated. The information she provided, dates, a meeting location, the name of the intermediary who had approached her, became the foundation of the plan that unfolded over the following week, a plan that Imani, to her own surprise, was allowed to be part of in ways that felt entirely unlike the marriage she had lived for the first 2 years. Kaido began speaking to her the way she imagined he spoke to Ren and Tetsu, in clipped, efficient sentences that assumed her intelligence rather than protecting her from it, and something in Imani that had been starved for 2 years without her fully realizing it began, slowly, to come back to life. The confrontation, when it finally came, happened on a warehouse pier along the bay, chosen because it was neutral ground, chosen because Nakashima believed a public meeting would prevent Kaido from moving against him openly. Imani was not supposed to be there. She had been told, in no uncertain terms, to remain at the estate with Ren and 2 other men for protection while Kaido, Tetsu, and a dozen soldiers went to meet Nakashima and settle the matter of the northern routes, the skimmed shipments, and the men who had died outside the estate gate 3 weeks earlier.
She went anyway.
It was not recklessness, she told herself later, climbing into the back of a car driven by a young soldier named Daichi, who had clearly not been informed he was supposed to say no to her. It was the same instinct that had once made her run toward a coding patient instead of away from one, the understanding that some situations required a person willing to act rather than wait to be told what was happening. She had learned enough about Kaido's world in the last month to know that meetings like this one sometimes went wrong in ways that had nothing to do with anyone's intentions, and she was not willing to sit in a house 3 miles away not knowing whether her husband would come home. She arrived at the warehouse district as the meeting was already underway, the 2 groups facing each other across 20 feet of wet concrete under sodium lights that turned everyone's faces the color of old bruises. She stayed in the shadow of a shipping container, close enough to see, far enough to remain unnoticed, and watched Kaido stand at the center of his own men with a stillness that radiated a kind of authority she had never fully appreciated until she saw it directed at someone other than her. Nakashima was older than she expected, silver-haired and soft-spoken, with the kind of calm that belonged to men who had stopped being afraid of consequences a long time ago. "You've been slow to respond, Yamashiro," he was saying. "I began to wonder if the stories about you had been exaggerated." "You sent men to my home," Kaido said, his voice carrying across the space without needing to rise. "You threatened what is mine. I am not slow. I was thorough." "Thorough," Nakashima repeated, amused. "Is that what we're calling it, when it takes a man 3 weeks to identify a housekeeper?" Something shifted in the air, a subtle recalibration that Imani felt rather than understood, and she realized, watching Kaido's expression not change at all, that Nakashima had just confirmed something crucial, that he had known about Reiko, had perhaps orchestrated her recruitment himself, which meant the information Reiko had given them might be compromised, might be exactly what Nakashima wanted them to have. She saw it before Kaido's men did, the subtle movement along the roofline of the warehouse behind Nakashima's group, a shape that did not belong to the silhouette of the building, and her stomach dropped with a certainty that came from some deep animal part of her brain. "Kaido," she said, too quiet to carry the distance, and then, realizing there was no time for quiet, she stepped out from behind the shipping container and shouted his name at the top of her voice, pointing at the roofline as every head in the warehouse turned toward her in shock. The shot that came from the roof missed Kaido by inches, because in the half-second between her shout and the gunfire, he had already begun to move, some instinct honed over a lifetime pulling him sideways as chaos erupted across the pier. Gunfire answered gunfire. Kaido's men returned fire toward the rooftop shooter, while Tetsu physically threw himself between Kaido and the widening line of fire from Nakashima's own soldiers, who had apparently been prepared for exactly this outcome all along. Imani dropped behind the shipping container as bullets sparked off metal somewhere above her head, her heart slamming against her ribs, every nurse's instinct in her screaming to move, to help, to do something other than crouch uselessly in the dark. She thought of Kaido's face when he found her at the window weeks ago, the terror in it, and understood in a visceral new way what that terror had actually meant. The fight was short and brutal, the kind of violence that in memory would collapse into fragments, the specific sound of Tetsu grunting as a bullet grazed his shoulder, and he did not slow down. The moment Kaido closed the distance to Nakashima himself with a speed that did not look human. The older man's face changing from calm certainty to genuine fear in the half-second before Kaido had him by the collar with a blade Imani had not even seen him draw. "Call it off," Kaido said, and his voice was the coldest thing Imani had ever heard, carrying easily now across a pier gone suddenly, terribly quiet except for the moaning of wounded men on both sides. "Call it off, or I open your throat on this pier in front of both our men, and you die knowing your organization ends with you." "You wouldn't," Nakashima managed, though his voice had lost its calm entirely. "You sent men to my home," Kaido said, and something in his voice cracked the composure Imani had always thought of as absolute, revealing underneath it something molten and furious and entirely, terrifyingly sincere. "You put a bullet within inches of the only thing in this world that ever made me want to survive it. I have very little left to lose tonight, Nakashima. Test that at your own risk." The standoff held for 3 long seconds, and then Nakashima, calculating even now, made the only rational choice available to him. "Stand down," he called out, his voice carrying to his remaining men on the rooftop and along the pier. "Stand down, all of you." The gunfire stopped. In the sudden ringing silence, Imani rose from behind the shipping container, her legs unsteady beneath her, and Kaido's head turned instantly toward the movement, his eyes finding her across the wreckage of the confrontation with an expression that mixed fury and relief, and something that looked, in that broken light, almost like love finally given permission to show itself completely. He released Nakashima with a shove that sent the older man stumbling, and crossed the pier to her in long strides, and when he reached her, he did not ask if she was hurt this time. He simply pulled her against him, both arms wrapped around her so tightly she could feel his heart hammering through his chest, and said nothing at all for a long moment, as though words had temporarily failed him entirely. "You saved my life," he finally said, into her hair. "You told me I wasn't foolish," she said, her voice shaking now that the adrenaline was beginning to recede. "I decided to prove it." Nakashima, humiliated and defeated in front of his own men, agreed within the week to withdraw entirely from the northern shipping routes and to pay reparations for the estate attack, a settlement brokered not through further violence, but through Kaido's calm, absolute demonstration that he was no longer a man who could be tested without consequence. The war that had threatened to consume both organizations ended not with more bodies but with a peace that held, in the way peace holds when one side has made unmistakably clear what the cost of breaking it would be. Reiko was sent to Nagoya to be near her sister after all, though not in the way she had originally planned, and under conditions that ensured she would never again be in a position to sell anyone's secrets. Run was promoted. Tetsu's shoulder healed within weeks, and he wore the scar the way he seemed to wear everything, without comment. And in the house that had once felt to Imani like a beautiful, silent cage, something had changed permanently. Kaido no longer disappeared behind the door of his study, without a word. He told her things now, not everything, because some things about his world would always require distance for her own safety, but enough that she no longer felt like a stranger in her own marriage. He said her name the way he had that night in the study, she realized one evening, watching him across the dinner table, except now he said it to her directly, not about her to other men, and it sounded entirely different when it was hers to hear. "I used to think love was a weakness I couldn't afford," he told her one night, months later, as they stood together on the balcony overlooking the garden where 2 strangers had once died and a marriage had nearly stayed alive forever. I thought if I let myself need you, it would be the thing that finally broke me, the way it broke my brother. And now? Imani asked. Now I think the only thing that could have broken me was continuing to pretend I didn't, Kaido said, taking her hand in his thumb tracing slow circles against her knuckles. You heard me call you foolish, and instead of leaving, you decided to become someone I couldn't call foolish anymore. That's not weakness, Imani. That's the strongest thing I have ever witnessed. She looked out at the garden, at the quiet dark shape of the estate that had once felt like a prison and now, finally, felt like something closer to a home, chosen rather than simply inherited. I'm still trying, she said, but now I know exactly what I'm trying for. He turned her hand over in his and pressed a kiss to her palm, an old-fashioned gesture that felt, from him, like the most honest thing he had ever done. Then keep trying, he said quietly. I promise you, from now on, I will be trying too. Below them, the rain that had been falling on and off for months finally cleared, and the garden lay quiet and glistening under a sky finally, briefly, full of stars. If this story pulled you in, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more dark romance stories just like this one, and drop a comment below telling me what part hit you the hardest. There's more where this came from, so stay close.